All right, you guys, welcome aboard this evening. We are going to continue our class on Second Temple Judaism tonight. I will remind you next week we're going to wrap it up with a class on the Messianic current. What were they looking for in a Messiah? And did Jesus deliver that? Or was he something completely different than what they were expecting? But tonight, Jeff Michel's going to teach us about sectarianism. Who were these different sects of the Jews, the Pharisees, the Sadducees? Where did they come from? Things like that. Okay. So I'm going to pray and then I'm turn it over to Jeff. All right. Let's pray. Holy God, thank you for this opportunity to learn. I pray that you'll be with Jeff tonight and fill him with your spirit and help us to really learn a little bit more about what was going on in Judaism that Jesus was born into. Who were these people? What did they think? What did they believe? Help us to have an understanding of that so that we can better frame the Gospels and better understand your word for our own personal edification and knowledge. Again, be with Jeff. Help him to instruct us well tonight. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tom. I will now share my screen. 1 second. Can you guys see my screen? Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, we got it, Jeff. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Awesome. So welcome to the third class on Second Temple Judaism. Screen is freezing up here. Yes, but before I get into sectarianism, I will be talking about synagogues as well. So this class, in this class, I'm going to discuss how synagogues came about, as well as the different sects. But before I do that, unlike the movies, I am going to roll the credits first and not at the end. So I want to give a special thanks to Tom Hughes for spearheading these series of classes, Ted Gill, who taught our class 2 weeks ago, and Rebecca, who helped me with putting this together, but really just the entire Garden State teaching ministry, just for your input in making these classes awesome. You guys are great. I want to give an honorable mention to someone by the name of Josephus. Josephus, he is a historian. Let me try to move this over here. How do I? Yeah, so Josephus, he is a historian. Some believe he was a Sadducee, others say he was a Pharisee, but we know that he was a Jewish historian, and he was born sometime after Jesus, and he's known for writing several books. Any scholar who teaches will at some point reference Josephus because of his work. So synagogues. Synagogues in the Hebrew is Beit Knesset, or house of. Whenever you see Beit, it means house of. Knesset means to gather or to congregate. So basically it's a house of assembly. You could think of it as house churches. So synagogues really began as house churches. And they would meet every Sabbath, and the scriptures that we're going to look at will explain that. And what would happen in the synagogue is they would come together for Beit Tefillah, which is a time of prayer. But not only would they pray, they would also read from the Torah and study the Torah. And it also functioned as a school. This is where a lot of Jewish rabbis went for their formal education in becoming a rabbi. And it was a social center. A lot of legal proceedings happened in a synagogue. So it was started off as an all-purpose room. Some rabbis believe that synagogues originated in the time of Leviticus, and we're talking about 1446 to 1444 BC. And in Leviticus 23, verse 3, it says, "The Lord spoke to Moses again, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the Lord's appointed times, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations." And convocation was an assembly of people called together for a meeting, and at these appointed times. God said, for 6 days you may work may be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. So God wanted people to come together at a certain place on the Sabbath. And he says, you shall not do any work. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Later on in Psalm 74, now this is in 930 BC, at this point, Babylon came in and they besieged Jerusalem. And this psalmist by the name of Asaph, who was a musician in the tabernacle, wrote this. They said in their heart, let's completely subdue them. They have burned all the meeting places of God in the land. So when they were besieged, they destroyed all the synagogues, all the meeting places. At that time, there was about 460 to 480 meeting places, these synagogues. And that's pretty tremendous. The state of New Jersey has approximately 512 middle schools. So imagine all the middle schools being completely eliminated, gone, all the middle schools in the state of New Jersey. That would have been horrific. This is exactly what happened to the synagogues at this time. So features of an ancient synagogue: one, it had to face towards Jerusalem. This is something that Jews even today do. Whenever they pray, they always face Jerusalem. And this was an ordinance from when Solomon dedicated the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8. And we also know when we read Daniel, he prayed 3 times a day. When he opened his windows, he would open his windows, which was facing Jerusalem, and he would pray. The synagogues also featured a seat of Moses, which we're going to look at. We're going to look at the seating arrangements. We're going to talk about the Magdala stone that was found in one of the synagogues. We're going to discuss and see a table that the scrolls would be placed upon and read from. And we're going to look at an ark of scrolls. So this is the ruins of a synagogue in Chorazin, located in Galilee. And this is at least 100 years even before Jesus comes to the scene. And archaeologists believe that Jesus might have taught at this synagogue and some others that we will look at. This is the interior of another synagogue in Galilee. And we see this in Matthew chapter 4. Jesus was constantly going around proclaiming the kingdom of the good news in every synagogue. So this is another one in Galilee. This is the inside of a first century synagogue. And to your left, this is where the congregants would meet. They would sit right here, and also over here in the center and off to my right. And this is a Magdala stone that was discovered in 1920. And it's very interesting. We're going to take a look at some of the carvings on this Magdala stone. So archaeologists said that this Magdala stone, it was the most significant discovery related to the Second Temple. And we've all heard of Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene was from Magdala. Now, her name wasn't actually Magdalene. She was referred to as Magdalene because she was from the town of Magdala. Just like Jesus was called the Nazarene. That's because Jesus came from Nazareth. So Mary is called Mary Magdalene to identify not her last name, but where she's from. And we read about her in Luke chapter 8. So some of the features on this Magdala stone is the menorah, which I'm going to talk about. There's 2 pillars on there, 2 vessels, what they believe is an altar of incense. And someone by the name of Mordecai Aviam said this in his journal: this Migdal stone, which is the Hebrew term for Magdala, with its decorations is the first and only collection of symbols to show the importance of the temple to the people who frequented the synagogue there in the community of Galilee. So very significant discovery. So here's a close-up of the Magdala stone. And here on the facade, we see what looks like 2 columns. And inside of the columns, you see 2 pictures. And these pictures were said to represent vessels that either contained wine, or they also symbolize 2 olive branches. And in the middle was the menorah, the candles, the candlesticks that is very popular in Jewish custom. It had 7 branches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And this was supposed to represent the 7 eyes of God. And most people believe that instead of the wine, these vats were filled with olive oil, because it would be the olive oil that kept these lamps burning on the menorah. And this box over here is said to be the altar of incense. So this is pretty remarkable, because when they sculpted this, they left us a snapshot of what it would have looked like to be in the temple courtyard looking out, which is pretty amazing. So that's the Magdala stone. And it's actually, these symbols are mentioned in Zechariah chapter 4, verses 1 through 14, which is also remarkable. So to put it all together, in the synagogue, there would be the Magdala stone. Then there's the table placed on top of the Magdala stone, and then the scroll would be placed here, and the leading rabbi, the teacher, would read from here. There's no remains of the table, obviously, because wood deteriorates over time. So the archaeologists did not find any wooden tables. So in Matthew chapter 23, beginning in verse 2 to 4, Jesus says this: the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. And that's how they got their name, because to do this to others is just not fair, you see. So this is the seat of Moses. And we just read from Matthew where this first shows up, but it's also in Luke. Now, I'm not going to read all of this. I'll read certain parts. Here, this is Jesus in Luke, the beginning of his ministry. It says he went to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, like we've been looking at, as was his custom. He stood up to read. Another practice of teachers and rabbis at that time, dating back to Nehemiah, whenever someone was going to teach the word of God, they stood as they read the scriptures. So right now, I want everyone to stand. No, I'm just kidding. Please remain seated. But they would have everyone stand as the scriptures was being read. And it says, the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found a place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners." And they're actually thinking a physical freedom from their occupation of Rome, but Jesus, of course, meant a spiritual freedom. And recovery sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. So when Jesus sat down, he would have sat in Moses's seat. And any teacher who sat in Moses's seat at that time, they had the authority of God. And when Jesus shared this, the people were excited. They were probably giving each other high fives and doing cartwheels because, again, they thought he was the one who's going to free them from Roman oppression. But then he continues. He says, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And you will tell me, do here in Capernaum what we have heard that you did in Capernaum." But going down, he says, "I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All the people in the synagogues were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. So here, Jesus said something that really offended them. These Jews believed that they were God's chosen people, but here Jesus says, you know what? Sometimes God doesn't choose you guys, he chooses Gentiles. And they found that extremely offensive, so much so that they wanted to kill him. It reminds me of a time, I'm part of an organization called Toastmasters International, and we help people with their communication and leadership skills. And on one occasion, the opportunity came for me to serve at a prison. And I always wanted that opportunity because I want to be a sheep and not a goat. If you read the parable of the sheep and goats in Matthew 25, you know what I'm talking about. It talks about visiting prisoners. So I signed up and I went there, and I remember I went there on a few occasions, and me along with 2 other Toastmasters, we were in a room full of prisoners, over 20-something prisoners. They came in all shapes, sizes, colors, and that would have been like me going there saying, "You guys are great. God loves you. You're God's children." And they probably would have said, "Oh, Mr. Michelle," they called me Mr. Michelle. "Oh, Mr. Michelle, that's great. Oh, you're so kind." And then for me to turn around and say, "However, because of your crimes, you will face eternal damnation. Have a nice day." They probably would have been very offended, and I wouldn't have made it out there in one piece. But this is exactly what Jesus did. If we're going to frame the gospel, we got to understand some of the circumstances that was surrounding Jesus at the time. So this is a synagogue on top of a synagogue. If you look at the black part of your screen, this synagogue is in Capernaum, and they believe this was a synagogue dated in the time of Jesus, and it was in black basalt. And when that started to deteriorate, in order to preserve the synagogue as much as possible, they built another one on top of it, which is made out of white limestone. And they believe Jesus did miracles here and taught there in Capernaum. And there's a sign on it which says this: the late 4th century AD, white synagogue, because the limestone was white, whitish in color, built upon the remains of the synagogue of Jesus. So you're potentially looking at a synagogue in which Jesus preached and healed. Also in the synagogue, there would be an ark of scrolls. It was basically a cart with wheels, and the idea was to bring the scrolls to different synagogues. So to the left is a sculpture of it, and to the right is a drawing. So this is the exterior of the synagogue. I'm now going to take you inside. So as I mentioned before, this is the seating arrangements. They say the men would occupy this level here, and then the women would be up here on top. We have it here again to the left, and then the center there, and then to the right. Over here, this would be what? This is where Moses' seat would be. This is where the rabbis who were invited to teach would sit and teach from the Torah. And this would be the Magdala stone in the center, as we discussed earlier, the table, the scroll, and to the far right there is the cart. They would park the cart right there with the scrolls. And this is an outer view of what the synagogue would look like. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears and talk about sectarianism. What is it? It's a narrow-minded adherence to a particular sect or party or denomination. When I looked that up, I was like, wow, denomination, it existed even before Christianity. And a sect is basically a group with a difference of opinion, especially a religious opinion. Schism means division, separation, discord, disharmony. This doesn't sound too good. For example, there could be a schism between political parties, Republicans versus Democrat, conservatives versus liberals, etc. And it's a formal division in or separation from a church or religious body. And that's what I'm going to get into right now. So who were the Pharisees? Pharisees in Hebrew is the Purashim, or the separated ones. That means they separated themselves, again, a sect, from other groups, from other sects, and even at times from people. They practiced and taught in the synagogues, as we looked at. They followed the Torah. However, they followed the Torah, which is the written law, but they also followed the oral law, the traditions of their elders. And we see that in Matthew 15, which was a major point of contention between Jesus and the Pharisees. Believe it or not, they were widely loved because for the most part, they did try to do what was good, and they did teach the word of God to the population. Scholars say there were about 20 different sects, however, 2 schools of thought. There was the Hillel school of thought, and there was an emphasis not just on the law, but compassion as well. And then there was the Shammai, and they had a much stricter interpretation of the law, again, which led to a contention between Jesus and this particular group. It is believed that Jesus followed the school of Hillel almost entirely, according to the complete Jewish Bible, and we see that in scripture, and I have a few references in the upcoming slide. So there were about 6,000 Pharisees in the time of Jesus. It is said that they're the successor of the Hasidim. I believe that's where the word Hasidic comes from. A lot of you probably saw Hasidic Jews. They still wear a lot of the garbs that the Pharisees wore at the time. So they were pious Jews who joined forces with the Maccabees during the struggle for freedom from Syrian opposition from 166 to 142 BC. They were first called Pharisees during the reign of John Hyrcanus, 135 to 105 BC. They basically believed that God extends his grace to everyone who keeps the law. They believed in angels, spirits, and evil spirits as well, demons, and the resurrection. And we see that in Acts 23:8. They believe in the immortality of the soul, eternal life, and rewards. They believe in heaven and retribution after death. So they did believe in an afterlife. They believed in hell. They believed in heaven. And notably, they were nationalists who opposed Rome, the Roman rule, and just Rome occupying them. In Deuteronomy chapter 11, God instructs his people through Moses and says this: "You shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes." So when they got this command, what did they do? They took it physically and created these phylacteries, also known as tefillin. And what they were is they were these little boxes, kind of like engagement ring boxes. And inside of them would be these 4 scriptures, 2 from Exodus, 2 from Deuteronomy. And they would write them in these little pieces of paper like this. And then they would put them in the compartment inside the phylacteries. Okay, so they would be nicely tucked away inside there, just like that. And the writing that you see there are the scriptures from Exodus and Deuteronomy. And each tiny little scroll had its own compartment. Then they would attach a leather strap to the phylactery and put it on their forehead, because that's what God commanded. They were to have the words of God on their forehead, the forefront of their minds. And they would attach the phylactery on their left arm with the leather strap, the left side, because that's where their heart is. So they wanted to keep the word of God next to their heart. So they tied it right there on their left arm. And they would wrap the leather strap around their hands, around their arms 7 times. 7 is a number of perfection. And all the way down to their hand and their finger. So it's as though the word of God was on their mind, it's on their heart, and it proceeded down to their hands, which would have led to them doing the right actions. And again, Jews today still wear this garment. Now, Jesus had a problem with that. While scripture doesn't condemn phylacteries, as we just saw, what Jesus had a problem with is that they would make these phylacteries wide, because supposedly the wider the phylacteries, then the more pious they were, the more righteous they were. And that is not being humble. And Jesus called them out on it. But not only that, they had the tassels on their garments long. So the tassels look like this, and this comes from Numbers chapter 15, where God told Moses to tell the Israelites that throughout the generations to come, you are to make these tassels on the corners of your garment with a blue cord on each tassel. The color blue was to represent the color of the sea and the sky and just God's glory in creating these. It says, you shall have these tassels to look at, and so you will remember all the commands of the Lord, that you may obey them and not prostitute yourselves by chasing after the lust of your own heart and eyes. So again, nothing wrong with making the tassels. These tassels were from prayer shawls. They were on prayer shawls, and it was considered the most holy or sacred part of the prayer shawl. In fact, the woman who was healed, who was subject to bleeding, this was the part of Jesus' garment that she held to that led to her healing. So here it is again. The tassels were called Tzitzit. And here is a Jewish gentleman in full garb. He has the tefillin on his head and his arm, the straps around his arm and around his hand, and there's the Tzitzit. So this is what the Pharisees would have looked like. Now, someone by the name of William Barclay on the Talmud said there were 7 types of Pharisees. 6 of them were bad, 1 was good. There was the shoulder Pharisee. The shoulder Pharisee, they pretty much did things for men to see, and Jesus discussed that in Matthew chapter 6. There was a wait a little Pharisee, meaning that they would look for reasons as to why they didn't need to do the righteous deeds right away. Then there was the bruised and bleeding Pharisees. What's that about? So these Pharisees, they were afraid to look at women in public. They just wouldn't look at women in public. They wouldn't look at their own wives in public or any female relatives. And what would happen is they would bump into objects, and hence they would bleed. And some of them took pride in that to show that they were trying to avoid sin at all costs. While it's the right heart to have, we need to avoid sin at all costs, but it shouldn't be in the form to draw even more attention to us to show how righteous we are. And this is what the Pharisees were doing. Then there's the humpback Pharisee. He was supposedly so humble that he walked with a humped back, just to show people how lowly he was and humble. Then there was the always counting Pharisee. They always counted up all their good deeds as though God were indebted to them. And we see an example of that in the parable of the Pharisee and tax collector in Luke chapter 18. Then there was the fearful Pharisee. These Pharisees believed that God could strike them down at any time. They were walking in fear and just really, they didn't see God as a gracious, loving, and compassionate God. And then we come to the one and only good Pharisee. This is the God-fearing Pharisee, and Nicodemus that we read about in John, he is an example of that. Jesus talks about the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And, oops, and my screen disappeared. Okay, we're back. So he says, be careful, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They discussed this among themselves and said, is it because we didn't bring any bread? And aware of their discussion, he says, oh, you have little faith. Why are you talking about having no bread? Don't you understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls you gathered? The answer to that was 12. Jesus feeds 5,000 people. They pick up 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Then Jesus says, okay, what about when I fed the 4,000? How many basketfuls of leftover bread did you pick up? And they said 4. and we see the scriptures here. So if you follow what's happening, first Jesus feeds 5,000 people, then it drops to 4,000 people. And from picking up 12 basketful of leftover bread to 7. So what's happening here? And Jesus tells them the answer. He said, how is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So these guys were teaching things that was pulling people away from the Lord. And they managed to pull away over 1,000 people from Jesus. I mean, imagine that. So it was their teaching, but also their hypocrisy, as we see in Luke. Jesus interestingly calls them blind Pharisee. Not going to read all of this, but it's when the two men, they're blind, they call to Jesus, they say, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. And Jesus, he heals them. And the Pharisees, they say, oh, it is by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. This is an interesting paradox, because here you have the blind men who couldn't see, they couldn't see physically. However, they were able to see things spiritually, because they were able to see that, oh, this is the promised Messiah. This is the Son of David, okay? However, the Pharisees, who were supposed to see spiritually, they only saw things physically. They could see things physically, but spiritually, they couldn't see that Jesus was the Son of David, that he was the Messiah. All right, we're gonna go into who were the Sadducees. So the Sadducees in Hebrew, it's Zudukim. Experts believe that they came from the priesthood of Zadok, and we read about them in 2 Samuel chapter 8. Basically, when the Jews turned their back on God, God turned to Zadok the priest. Him and his sons took charge of the temple when we read Ezekiel chapter 40 to 44. They were a political group. They consisted of high priests. They came from very wealthy families. They were merchants. They were appointed by Rome to occupy. They were appointed by Roman occupiers, leading to their political and civil power, their influence. It all came from Rome. They believed in the reestablishment of the temple. However, they focused on the temple and not so much synagogues. They felt like synagogue attendance was not necessary. A very popular Sadducee was Caiaphas the high priest, and he's the one who asked Jesus if he was the Son of God in Mark chapter 14, 61 to 62, and basically tore his robes and gave Jesus the death sentence. So during the long period of the two-party struggle, which lasted until the Romans' destruction of Jerusalem in 70 in the Common Era, the Sadducees, again, they dominated the temple and the priesthood. But not only that, they were part of the Sanhedrin. They dominated that as well. The Sanhedrin was composed of about 70 men. Some of them were Pharisees, some of them were Sanhedrin, but it seems like the Sanhedrin were the ones who really dominated that group and were in charge of a lot of the rulings. The Sadducees refused to go beyond the written Torah. So they believe in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, but they completely rejected the oral traditions of the Pharisees, again, which brought them to a point of contention with the Pharisees. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe in life after death, the soul, spirits. Again, they did not believe in the direct resurrection, and that is why they're called Sadducee, because to not believe in the resurrection is sad, you see? All right, moving on. Who were the Essenes? They probably originated among the Hasidim, along with the Pharisees, from whom they later separated, and we see this in according to First Maccabees. They were a group of very strict and zealous Jews who took part in the Maccabees revolt against the Syrians. They observed purity of laws of the Torah, and they practiced communal ownership of property. They had a strong sense of mutual responsibility. Daily worship was an important feature, along with daily study of the sacred scriptures. They attributed everything that happened to fate. Okay. They were a very strict and zealous group of Jews. Again, they took part in the Maccabees revolt. There were about 4,000 of them. They believed in immortality and punishment for sin, but unlike the Pharisees, they didn't believe in a resurrection, but they did follow certain purity laws. With few exceptions, they shunned the temple. They kind of stayed away from that, and they were content to live ascetic lives. A lot of them just separated themselves from society. They kind of lived like monks, and marriage was not condemned in principle, but they kind of avoided it. And they were actually credited with finding the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now we're going to talk about the Zealots. Who were the Zealots? Oops. So they were an extreme section of the Pharisees, again, very hostile towards the Romans. They were founded by Judas of Galilee, as we see in Acts chapter 5. Simon, who was one of the apostles, was a zealot. It originated during the reign of Herod the Great. And again, they were exterminated at Masada in 73 AD. And they turned to terrorism and assassination. And I believe Tom mentioned this in his first class. They became known as the Sicarii, or dagger men, because they would have these daggers and they would basically strike down anyone who was friendly with Rome. And in the first revolt against Rome, they played a leading role. And at Masada, it is believed that they committed suicide rather than surrender the fortress. Here is a picture of the Masada fortress. It is the most visited place in Israel. The Jews take a lot of pride in the Masada fortress because they were able to fend off Roman soldiers for quite a bit. And some believe that when the Romans, being the Romans, finally did penetrate their defenses, that they committed suicide rather than be taken captive and made slaves to Rome. And the other belief is that Rome actually did come in and kill them. Again, there are different views as to exactly what happened there. But again, just a source of pride for them to know that they were able to fend off the Jews for a little bit. Who were the Herodians? The Herodians, they existed between 55 BC and AD 93. They got their names basically by being followers of King Herod. They were influential Jewish supporters who ruled parts of Palestine and the area there. They were a political party who wanted to restore Herod to the throne. And they were political foes of the Pharisees who wished to restore the kingdom of David. And again, we find them 3 times in the gospel, so not too many. They're not very prominent in the gospel, but 3 times when the Pharisees, they went out and they began to plot how they might kill Jesus along with the Herodians, because Jesus challenged their beliefs in terms of healing at the synagogue on the Sabbath. And we see this in Matthew 6. And it also says, they, meaning the Pharisees, sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. This time it was about taxes, whether Jesus paid taxes or not. And again, this is repeated in Mark chapter 12. So they always tried to catch Jesus in terms of taxes, or they were always trying to get him to say some anti-Roman statements. And although they were politically opposed to the Pharisees, they participated with them. These guys actually came together to put Jesus to death. And speaking of Jesus, we spoke about these different sects. So which sect did Jesus align himself with? Was Jesus a Pharisee? This is just to provoke some thought. What do you think? Was Jesus a Pharisee? Because in Luke chapter 7, it says he was invited to dinner by a Pharisee. And we know they're the separated ones. So if he wasn't a Pharisee, why did they invite him to dinner? Jesus spoke highly at times of Pharisees. In Matthew 5:20, he said, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And as we saw, he sat in Moses' seat in the synagogues. So what is that all about? If they're separate, how did Jesus get to teach and preach in their synagogues and sit at Moses' seat? We know Jesus wore talit, as I mentioned, a prayer shawl with the tassels. And this is how the woman in Mark chapter 5, when she reached out and touched the hem of his garment, it was actually the tzitzit, the tassel, that healed her. And as we looked at, there were 2 schools of thought. There was the Hillel and the Shammai. And we see Jesus showing compassion, which is what the Hillel group was all about. And we see him showing compassion in Luke chapter 7:13, also 15:20. Again, this is according to the Jewish Bible. So this is the case for why some may believe that Jesus was a Pharisee. But let's look at the other side. Perhaps Jesus was not a Pharisee because he ate with sinners and tax collectors. In fact, another point of contention was that Jesus had with the Pharisees was him sitting with sinners and tax collectors. So if he was a Pharisee, he probably would not associate with sinners and tax collectors. And as far as righteousness of the Pharisee, well, they were righteous Pharisees. Nicodemus was one of them. However, not every Pharisee was righteous. And we looked at the 6 types, but also in Matthew 19, Jesus challenged them because he says their hearts were actually hard. Also, Jesus healed on the Sabbath. Again, the Pharisees really opposed that and challenged Jesus on that, as we see throughout the Gospels. Again, Jesus sat in Moses' seat. Well, that's okay, because the Pharisees often invited different sages, rabbis to come and teach. And again, Jesus wore talit, but it was no ordinary talit, because his talit actually brought healing, which was a fulfillment of prophecy. Because in Malachi chapter 4, we read that when the Son of Righteousness comes, he will have healings in his wings, meaning that what he wore, the talit, it's going to come with healing. And again, it's not just the talit itself, it's the faith, but his talit was special because of who Jesus is. Also, Jesus said he was the Son of God. That would be considered blasphemy. Would a true Pharisee say something as blasphemous as being the Son of God? And lastly, it's fine to show compassion. Anyone can show compassion, and we see Jesus always extending compassion to others. But I believe that Jesus was not a Pharisee. He probably identified with them because he believed in the Torah, but he himself was not a Pharisee. And the scriptures doesn't explicitly say that he was a Pharisee. If we look at Paul, scriptures does say explicitly that he was a Pharisee if we look at Acts 26, verse 5. So what did Jesus refer to himself as? Simply as the Son of Man. And we see this in Luke chapter 5, as well as many other places in the gospel. So that's framing the gospel for our upcoming class, which will be led by Tom. So this has been the third class on Second Temple Judaism. The two takeaways I have for you is this: God has been working for centuries and through everything so that the gospel could flourish despite sectarianism. And also, let's not allow sectarianism to creep into our hearts and into our church as it has in our world. And 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10 to 14 talks about that. Thank you, and may God bless you all.